From the beginning, I ask my students, do you know why you're here? And they always look at me like, you're the teacher. You're supposed to know that. And so I talk about the research that suggests that when you finish with a college education, students retain like, what, 2% of what they learned in the classroom. So then I ask them, well, if that's so, why don't we then just do the Time Life, video series, why are you here? Then we talk about process and so forth. So I begin a class like that. I make my students, I require them to keep journal assignments, creative writing, and some other classes. And at the very end of the classes, I have, my creative writing students have to give me a portfolio and write me a paper on what they have learned and assess themselves. My one freshman class, the last piece of assessment they have to do is to write a letter to the following class the next year on what they wish they had learned. So it's a kind of a round robin. But I also try to listen to them. Really listen. And try to adjust and look for what I call happy accidents and try to incorporate that.
Chrissy?
I was sitting here the whole time thinking, of course, rate my professor is the #1 way. I'm just smiling because I visit campuses regularly and consult and work on faculty development issues, and faculty evaluation seems to be one of the hottest issues right now. And I'm an advocate for a holistic approach, and I'm also sometimes upset administrators when I say I think student evaluation, reflections from student evaluation should be used for solely reflective purposes, and that we should be evaluated on our improvement of those and how we reflect on those and how we decide to improve on our student evaluations, not on the student evaluations themselves. I work in a department myself where my colleagues hate me because we have an average, and people throw the average, and it's unfair to compare my psychology classes to political science classes to history classes. Not to say that political science and history aren't as fascinating as psychology, but apparently students aren't feeling that way always on their evaluations. So I do think there needs to be a lot of thought put into a holistic approach in terms of how we're evaluated. The other thing I noted is that I see a movement across the country toward, of course, undergraduate research, products, and competencies. And so I feel like I know I'm doing a good job based on the products that students create, based on the competencies that they develop. So everyone's familiar with Bloom's and so forth. I feel like we do need to be looking at the hierarchy and what our students are creating, what they're producing, the skills that they're developing, and be evaluated on that. I will say, one of the things that was most impressive to me about my colleagues on the panel is that we came to DC each with a student supporting us and introducing us, and talking to the students of my colleagues, that alone was evidence of how effective they are. Attar, particularly, I remember talking to his graduate student, and one of the things that tells me he's very effective at what he does is the graduate student that he produced, if that makes sense. And so I think we need to be looking at legacy, and I try not to drop resources quite frequently, but the one that's worth noting is things like backward design and Dee Fink's creating significant learning experience books. She's a fan. I think it's creating significant learning experiences and transformative experiences for students. So evidence that a student has been changed through the course. And I'm just lucky enough to teach things like social psychology, in which the whole point is to transform the student's mind about culture and how they see culture and difference and so forth. So one of the ways I know that is that they're thinking differently by the end of the course than they were at the beginning of the course, and they're acting and behaving differently as well. And I also have the luxury of teaching things like counseling psych topics, where we're talking about relationships and interpersonal communication, and so I can, as Lois said, through student writing, see that they are applying the concepts of the course and so forth. So I do think it does depend on what you're teaching and what the outcomes for that teaching are and so forth, but clearly holistic, and perhaps Attar has some other things you want to say about that.
Tom, please.
I believe that teaching excellence, the way one should be looking at it is to see that whether people are doing things holistically, as Christy said. You cannot have assessment which is only one kind. I have two daughters, and both of them went to universities in Florida. And there were some classes where they simply had multiple choice tests. And those were all knowledge-based multiple choice tests. So you're not making any kind of evaluation or synthesis through those multiple choice tests. So it's very important for us to realize that when a student is coming into class, that he or she is expecting that they will learn from their class. And it's our duty to make sure that they do learn. And one of the things which I look at when I do assess my students is to look at 4 steps. One is to see, have they acquired the knowledge? That's the first step. The second thing is to see that whether they apply that knowledge. And the third one is to see that do they know when to apply that knowledge, which is the contextual sense. And the last one, which is the most important, which now is gaining a lot of traction, is to see that why they are applying that particular knowledge, which is the conceptual understanding of the course. So I have some advice for my department heads, although the department head is very gracious about looking at those things, is to see that whether the students or whether the teacher is doing those things in the classroom itself. So if these kind of things are done in the classroom, I think many classrooms will change. And one of the things which I do want to say is that many times assessments which we do, they might be only sporadic in nature, which means that people might just give a midterm exam and a final exam and you're done. And that's not a good way of making students learn. It has been shown time and again. There was a recent paper written on what are the kind of things which help a student learn. Is it highlighting the book? Is it underlining the book? Is it rereading the book all the time and trying to understand it? They found 2 things which came to the top. The first thing is distributed practice, which means that if you have an exam which you're giving monthly, every 30 days or so, the key number is 10 to 20%. Because every 3 to 6 days, the student should be doing something. And you have to somehow not force the student, but to give him or her the opportunities of being able to do that distributed practice. And if that distributed practice is in an atmosphere which is almost represents the test itself, that's even better. So those 2 things, if most of us will do, I think we will see a lot of improvement in how students are learning. And if those things are accounted for, then in the teaching evaluations of our faculty members, you will take a great step towards that.
Tom?
Am I lame for knowing what my ratemyprofessor.com is? I mean,
It's good to be aware.
it seems taboo, and these microphones set up in this way remind me of congressional hearing. But I'll talk to colleagues who will say, Mr. Senator, I categorically deny having any knowledge of my ratemyprofessor.com evaluation. Maybe I am lame because I do care. And I know it's not the most moderated piece of evidence or piece of the puzzle, and I don't place primary importance on it. But I do, in general, care. What the students do think of me. And my advice to evaluating the student feedback anyway is similar to my advice about passion. You don't think about how to improve your student evaluation. You want to think about how do I improve student success in my classroom. And when you do so, your evaluations are going to resonate and increase as well. So I agree with Christy as well when she says, you have to bring in all these, it's a holistic process. You have to bring in these different pieces of the puzzle. I think self-evaluation is enormously important, self-reflection, and not doing something in class just because you did it last year, whether it succeeded or not. I find myself to be one of my toughest critics. And how chair do you mentioned that, for example, how department heads deal with evaluating effective teachers. Well, like it or not, we live in a peer-reviewed world. We do. Our publications are peer-reviewed. If you want to borrow telescope time on some of our large national telescopes, it's a peer-review process. And I do think there can be some value in peer review of your teaching efficacy. Personally, again, I mentioned I'm a chemist by training, so I'm going to have a quantitative answer, but I'm a teacher not by training, by good fortune. So I'm going to have a more moral, ethical answer as well. Quantitative answer is, how effective are you as a teacher? Well, I think you can put numbers on retention in your class. I mean, again, it's sometimes taboo to say so, but it's a valid thing to think about. There's a cost for educating a student, and paying attention to student success will help with those costs. Less students withdrawing from courses, higher graduation rates. I think these are part of the holistic puzzle, and I think it's okay to get quantitative a little bit in this. But personally, how I evaluate if I've been a successful teacher is to see if I've convinced the student, not just if I cared, if I convinced the student that I cared about their success in that course. If I convinced the student that I care about their success after the course, if they get a job or not, and there's another quantitative metric to how effective of a teacher you were. If I haven't convinced the students that I intimately care about how they do in their course room and their career, then I don't assess myself very well. I don't think I did my job.
Interesting. Christy?
Can I add to this? I don't want to get out of order, but I'm looking at a checklist. I told Kevin that I didn't want to be the nerd on the panel who made handouts for people and so forth, but now I think that because I do a lot of faculty development workshops, have a lot of self-reflective checklists on topics and things. One that I'm looking at here is a checklist on things that we can do to help students be successful. And I love that Qatar mentioned distributed practice, and this kind of relates to what Todd was talking about as well. One of the other things related to that on my checklist is early and frequent low-stakes assessment with developmental feedback such that students reflect upon their own learning. So the movement, I think, is towards helping students take responsibility for their own learning, become more reflective learners. A lot of things that we need to do at the 1,000 and 2,000 level to create success, retention, progression, so that by the time they get into the programs and so forth, they are chemists, but they're learning to learn as they go. And I'll send these to Kevin if he wants to distribute these as well, and that might be helpful to folks.
That's a great lead into my next question, because on occasion I hear from students that, surprise, surprise, professors aren't living up to students' expectations. I also hear from faculty that increasingly students aren't living up to professors' expectations. All of you have been in higher education for a number of years, some more than others. I wonder if you might comment on changing times and attitudes, expectations of students, of faculty, and vice versa. Walter?
Well, as I was saying in the first question is that if you look at the top traits of good teachers when they followed them was making an emotional connection with the students, and the second was high expectations. I'm not here to compromise on the last one, on the high expectations. In fact, sometimes I do get student comments saying that I expect too much from them. But I think it has been found out that even in inner city schools, where you may find that there aren't as many resources available, even there, the students do want high expectations from their teachers. So I don't think we should compromise on that at all. So far as my expectations of students are concerned, I think those are not changed very much because the word gets out, and I have high expectations. So they do hunker down and give me what they're supposed to do for themselves. So far as their expectations of me are concerned, is that they have changed over the years. I'm supposed to be available 24 hours a day. So I have made some adjustments. So that means that I don't show up for 8 hours a day to USF. So I try to distribute my time so that I can be there almost 24 hours a day. So I have a classroom discussion board on Piazza where students can ask questions at any time of the day. Either the student answers the question or the instructor asks the questions. I can also change the student's answers because sometimes they're conceptually not right answers. So if I'm able to meet those student expectations, I think the students also rise to the occasion because they see that how much effort you are putting in to get to them as fast as you can. So I think it's a two-way street, and once that two-way street has the same mission, of making them good, productive citizens of society, I think we're in a win-win situation.
Lois?
Yeah, I guess I would divide it up into two areas. One would be content and one would be experience, the experience of the classroom. And so in terms of content, for me personally, I don't see much has changed, since Socrates, at least for me. The Socratic method is what I like to use and one that I think is, effective and my students seem to respond well to that, to challenge them. They want to be challenged. They want to be, they want to learn. And I believe that for me anyway, that you must have that real high expectation in a real positive way. I think if you go into a classroom thinking, the lazy students or whatever, that's not going to work. I assume my students want to learn, even if they don't know it. So there's that. But I think what's changed is the experience of the classroom. I have my iPhone now because I was embarrassed into getting it last year. They had my little flip phone. I said, I need an iPhone. And so, and so I am constantly, this morning I was on answering questions. No, I'm not in Phoenix. I'm in Tampa. So I think there's that expectation, good and bad, of the experience of the classroom, which I don't think we've really, as educators, had a full discussion of where it's going. So that I think is changing. But in terms of using the language of the course, using it in a way that relates to students' lives, to answer what I say to my students, the so what question. Why is this important? Why should we learn it? I think hasn't changed. And I refuse to give them answers to that question. They are required to think for themselves. And for many, especially the young women, it seems to be something that oftentimes has not been presented to them in a positive way.
Thank you. Tom?
This is a timely question because I had lunch, as I mentioned, with Bob Frazina, senior yesterday, and we were talking about expectations. And he said one of the biggest barriers he had to establishing NTID was to convincing people not to lower their expectations of these deaf and hard of hearing students. Bob also told me he's very proud of me for receiving this award and having an NTID represented here as well as USF. It's a win-win day for Bob Frazina. But what I didn't tell Bob is, early in my career, I made some mistakes, and I did underestimate our students. And I didn't realize that some of our deaf and hard of hearing students could do high-level, cutting-edge research. I did not think that some of them could go on to advanced degrees or be productive members of the workforce. And I was wrong, and I was a quick study. And now I'm very proud of our staggering employment rate of our graduates. The research that these students do with some of the best research that's ever been conducted, the data it's just pristine. And now, probably to a fault, so if I come back next year, I'll probably say I went too far the other way. I always give my students every benefit of the doubt, probably to a fault. So this is a good question and one I need to learn from because I need to find that balance of expectations for my students. But as of right now, I tend not to doubt the students. And the challenge is, with the students, and I'm glad that Kristen's going to go after me because I'm going to lob up grapefruit here because she's an expert in this. I'm going to let her speak eloquently about it. But the millennial student is a unique entity. It's a unique thing. They have unique needs. They have unique expectations about why haven't you responded to my email yet? And sometimes, sometimes they have, expectations of being entertained even in the classroom. And I'm not above that. I'm not above. I've made plenty of fool of myself in front of the classroom, and why not? Learning can be fun as well, but I'm still trying to figure out the millennial student. I think they have a lot of qualities. We spoke about some of the qualities at lunch. They don't see culture and race as much. Very open-minded, good-hearted people, I think. But the way of learning is certainly different. Their demands of the teachers and the use of technology is certainly different. So challenges, millennial student, Chris, go.
Yeah. Don't get started, any one of us started on our research, you're gonna have to cut me off here. But the thing that came to mind first is when I do a lot of workshops, I like to use student quotes from evaluations of professors. So one that comes to mind is the student said on the official evaluation of their professor, "If I only had an hour to live, I would spend it with my professor." It's kind of a sweet, wonderful, heartwarming, save it for your scrapbook kind of thing. But then the student went on to say, "Because my professor can make an hour seem..." I do think research and evidence suggests that the modern learner, and I had started out, my initial research was on the millennial learner, but I did gather enough data of our non-traditional students to realize that I needed to change my title of my topic to modern learner because there were very few significant differences actually in the non-trads as compared to the traditional millennials, which was really kind of a mind-blowing, shocking thing that made my research not as significant as I thought it would be. But so the characteristics, the things that I'm thinking of when you look at what's ideal, I've got a list in front of me of the top 5, and I don't think anybody will be surprised by this. And actually I have a 6 on the ideal learning environments for millennials. The number 6 I include typically because I think it's important. Their expectation is that we provide supportive materials, and that might be online support, and maybe handouts and things like that, physical. But the idea is that learning needs to be guided. The discussion that we had earlier also was that they've been inundated with information from the time they were very young. We talked about my own child. Ever since he was born, a click of the mouse and they can find any information that they want, how to make a paper airplane, the life cycle of a frog. Very different to our own experience when I was in college just over 20 years ago. I wanted to learn for the sake of learning. Information for information's sake was something I valued. It is not something that the modern learner values. They've had that access to that information. So as Lois said, the real trick is to make it relevant. The challenge that I had when I started 20 years ago is very different now than it was back then. And I think, and I don't know if this speaks to your student population at USF, but typically where I'm traveling, we have lots of open enrollment. And this is a horrible quote, but one of the things that I realized when my child went to school, everyone told me, kindergarten is the new first grade. It's very rigorous, right? I was a little freaked out by that. But what I like to say is, and it was true, but that college is the new high school. Everyone's going, right? 20 years ago, I had a student population that was very college prep prepared. I could say, write a research paper in a freshman intro psych class, and they all knew what I was talking about. They all had written a research paper, and they were all prepared to do so. I cannot walk into the classroom and say that at this point in time. Even institutions who aren't really open enrollment institutions have these same issues. So you may have about a third of the class that says, I'm good to go with writing a research paper, another third that kind of, I get it, I got to start out with a question, I got to do a lit review, but I need some help. And then another 1/3 that says, I've never written a research paper and I really don't even know how to go about this. So one of our great challenges is to guide the learning process. And I talk about my 5 big R's for the new millennials. So one of them is relevance. The other is research-based methods. So what I'm finding is that we're still using these methods that are not evidence-based. So I really highly emphasize resources like Ambrose's How Learning Works or Sousa's How the Brain Learns, so that we shift our methods to what we know actually works, as opposed to just doing what was modeled for us, do unto. And that's what I felt like when you asked the first question, I wasn't really prepared because I said, I want to be the professor that I didn't get. The professor I wanted to have when I was in college. The real issue was that I had a lot of professors who just used traditional methods that weren't very effective. So I want to use methods that we know are supported by research. in terms of the other hours, we may get to those later, but the other additional thing I want to say back on this list of the ideal learning environment is the number one thing was that it be interactive and participatory. So variety, and on my narrative portions of my survey, because I'm always using mixed methods, which I think is the way to go if you're doing research in terms of what's working in the classroom and what's not. It was very revealing because over and over again, more than 600 surveys, I read no lecture only. No lecture only. So one of my newer presentations is about the mini lecture, and we talked earlier today about the key to the mini lecture is making sure that it is mini. But I have many other tips like that. But the idea that variety is really critical for the modern learner because they've been raised in a completely different environment than most of us.
Thanks, Christy. I'm going to ask one more question, and then I become the roving mic, so you can get ready with your questions in the audience. But Lois, it follows up on a comment you made, and that is envisioning the classroom of the future, or the learning environment of the future. And of course, there's been ample reference to technology and the impact. I think what I'm hearing is mostly positive from your vantage point. But perhaps if each of you would just close your eyes for a moment and imagine the classroom or the learning environment in the higher education sector a decade out. Where do you, or maybe a decade's too far, you have license, full license to define the parameters. Todd, you want to start on that?
Sure. Maybe I'm not a visionary, but I'm hoping, that far in advance, or I'm thinking that far in advance, isn't too far from the direction that we're headed. I think the classroom of the future, the lecture of the future, will have mixed modalities. There are different time constraints that people put on as to what the retention time is of individuals. I partially fell asleep listening to
Yeah, right, exactly. If it's any consolation, when he mentioned 5 to 6 years out, I thought I'm just 5 to 6 years out from retirement, so all I can envision is a margarita and a beach chair.
What?
I need to hang it up, don't
I think you have to pulse your classroom with a whole bunch of different modalities. Tara was saying this morning, there's nothing wrong with some chalk talk. And I have some colleagues who can pepper a whiteboard and do it well, and do it well, and the students learn from it. But I'm a proponent of not overdoing that, so mix it in with some multimedia, some animation, some active learning, of course. So I think in doing so, you hit, obviously, the varied learning modes of your students. So I don't think that's that novel, but I'd like to see, I think we're going to have to go in that way too. Again, reach the millennial student. What's the next generation of students going to be called?
gosh, I forget now. I'm just
Anyone?
I think they're calling Z.
Z? So, the Z student, we might have to do this pulsing method in our classrooms even more. I'm going to continue, I think, to not fight with the wonders of science. I used to teach higher level chemistry, and I used to go in admitting to the students, this isn't hard, this is going to be abstract. But then I learned to adopt it, and there's so much wonder in science and innate care and curiosity about students' environment. You mentioned your son. You go to a luau, you're just fascinated by fire. I have fire.
That's a sign of development of antisocial personality. Fascinated by fire. That's why we're concerned.
That's why I became a chemist, actually. But every day in my classroom there is and will be some form of fire, hopefully controlled with some kind of demonstration, some kind of visual, an anticipatory set even, where you can engage the students' learning style or their level of understanding, and maybe they won't understand what this hopefully controlled explosion or fire means at the beginning of the class, but by the end of class, hopefully it'll make sense to the students. But again, that's one more method of mixing things up in the classroom. I think that's probably where we're headed.
Porter?
Well, I experimented with the flipped classroom this semester, which basically means that you have your videos, I suppose, on YouTube or some other medium, and you let the students watch the videos at home, and then they come to the classroom and we have a discussion. I only flipped half of the class because I basically selected the topics which are more conducive to the flipped classroom. And I also asked them to write 25 words, which was a mark to ask of engineering students. And what they
25 words that make sense. And all different.
Yeah, I do ask them to make complete sentences. And in those 25 words, they have to tell me that what they didn't understand about the topic. And I get those comments before I come into the classroom. Some students took the short way out saying that I understand everything about the topic. So I had to change my question. What did you find interesting about that particular chapter? So I get those 25 words, I read them, and then I try to figure out what questions I can ask in the classroom and see that what they have learned and what they have not learned. So there's a movement which is going on, which most of you must have heard about, the MOOCs, Massive Open Online Courses. And people are thinking that it's going to replace all of us here, including the ones who are right here. There's a saying by RPI deems that if a CD-ROM can replace an instructor, it should be. And I have the same saying, if a MOOC is going to replace an instructor, it should be. And what's going on here is that most people, the evangelists of MOOCs, they are looking at it as more of a selling product. They're salesmen, just like anybody trying to sell cars or sell houses. They're not interested in figuring out whether it's going to be good for this, eventually good for the society itself. So that's why the administrators of the university, especially state universities, will have to make a decision about how much of that MOOCs to really let creep into the college experience. Because we already find out that the AP experience itself is limited in some ways, that we don't transfer all the AP classes. And the same thing with the MOOCs also, where you may be able to transfer some of the experience which you have gained to MOOCs. What I've seen is that there might be a rush towards the flipped classroom, a rush towards MOOCs, because when